Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking a paper titled Music Making in Scratch, High Floors, Low Ceilings, and Narrow Walls, ? This paper is written by William Payne and Alex Ruthmann, and is also available for free. So you can find a direct link to it in the show notes at jaredoleary.com, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. You'll notice there that this podcast is powered by Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I work for. Go to bootuppd.org to learn more about the paid professional development or the free computer science education resources that I've created for Boot Up. All right, here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, music programming is an increasingly popular activity for learning and creating the intersection of computer science and music. Perhaps the most widely used educational tool that enables music programming is Scratch, the constructionist visual programming environment developed by the Lifelong Kindergarten Group at the MIT Media Lab. While a plethora of work has studied Scratch in the context of children creating games and coding interactive environments in general, very little has honed in on its creative sound or music-specific functionality. Music and sound are such an important part of children's lives, yet their ability to easily engage in creating music and coding environments is limited by the deep knowledge needed in music theory and computing to easily realize musical ideas. In this paper, we discuss the affordances and constraints of Scratch 2.0 as a tool for making, creating, and coding music. Through an analysis of limitations in sound code block design, a discussion of bottom-up music programming, and a task breakdown of building a simple drum loop, we argue and illustrate that the music and sound blocks, as currently implemented in Scratch, may limit and frustrate meaningful music making for children, the core user base for Scratch. We briefly touch on the history of educational music coding languages, reference existing Scratch projects and forums, compare Scratch with other music programming tools, and introduce new block design ideas to promote lower floors, higher ceilings, and wider walls for music creation in Scratch. End quote. Now, if I were to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I'd say that this paper problematizes the limitations of making music with Scratch. Now, you might be listening to this and go, okay, Jared, this is very specific. I know you have a background in music and computer science, but why? The reason why is because I think this serves as a wonderful example of some of the cautions around integration. Where a lot of people say they're going to integrate music in Scratch, or Scratch in ELA, or Scratch in math, science, whatever. And they do so in ways that really just kind of skim the surface of a discipline, either computer science or the other discipline, in a way that might be described as subservient, which I've talked about in other podcasts. So in this episode, we're going to dive deeper into a platform that I love. Listen to the interview with Mitch Resnick. I clearly have a passion for Scratch, as does Mitch. But even though I might love a platform, we need to talk about some of the problems. Now, note that this is for Scratch 2.0, this particular paper. And right now, at the time of this recording, in November of 2022, Scratch 3.0 is out. So there are more options for making music, but in general, the main crux of this particular paper still stands, in my opinion, which is why we're reading it. Well, I am. You're listening, but you can read it. It's in the show notes. You know what I mean. Or maybe you don't, and that's okay. All right, so in the background for this paper, it starts with describing how programming music is becoming more of a popular thing to do. However, a lot of the programs that people have explored through research tend to focus on computer musicians, so people who are more expert level, rather than novice programmers or musicians. So they provide some examples of some platforms or languages that specialize in creating music, and it's usually at the professional level, or at least expert level. However, there have been newer platforms that they mention, like Sonic Pi, which I actually facilitated in the 4th through 8th grade classes that I previously worked with, and then I even designed some curricular content for the university that I was contracted through. It was several years ago now. So it definitely can be done in elementary and above space. There's also platforms like EarSketch, which I have talked about previously. So that is, I've typically seen in high school and sometimes in middle school, and some other platforms like Scratch. Now, before the authors talk about Scratch, they kind of give you a little landscape preview of some of the other languages, like the ones that I just mentioned, but also Jython music, blocking, tone.js, etc. So if you're interested in actually diving into more musical examples, if you listen to any of those and you're like, wait, I don't know that one, well, cool. Take a look at this paper. Again, it's for free, and maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you'll find that perfect music platform that you always wanted to do to code music. But the next main subject section that I want to focus on is on Scratch. And so Scratch, as I've talked about in other episodes, like in interviews and unpacking scholarship episodes, this media arts platform where you can create games, stories, animation, music, all sorts of really cool things. It can be very simple projects, or absurdly complex to the point where I'm like scratching my head trying to figure out how it works, which is great because I learned something when I finally figure out, oh, that's how that works. But I'm a nerd and I like those problems. So in this section, they talk about how they had an undergraduate course that was titled the Creative Learning Design class that would create some Scratch projects that would then be user tested with 1st and 7th graders, which is an interesting range of students. And I mean that in a good way. I've actually known one of the authors, Alex, for several years now, maybe even a decade, and he's wonderful. All right, so the next subsection, the authors talk about, okay, what was the motivation behind it? So they mentioned that Scratch at the time of this publication, or at least writing it, there were 33 million registered users, 35 million projects shared, and that Scratch is famously known for having low floors, high ceilings, and wide walls. I don't remember if Mitch mentioned that in the episode, in the interview that I did with him, which again, I highly recommend listening to, but that is something that people very frequently associate with Scratch. So this paper kind of questions that. Here's a quote from my PDF, page 3. It might be on a different page for you, but it's the first paragraph under the motivation subsection. Quote, "However, when it comes to music projects, we believe Scratch has limitations. In terms of easily coding and playing pre-recorded and user-created audio files, one finds low floors. However, for users wishing to create music through sequencing musical notes or with engaging sounds and instruments, they often face high floors, low ceilings, and narrow walls due to complex numeric music mappings and mathematical representations, as well as data structures that limit musical expression," end quote. Again, this is Scratch 2.0, but I would argue that most of what they're talking about is still applicable in Scratch 3.0, most current release. And again, even though this is music, I'd argue this is also very applicable in other areas. So we're about to dive a little bit deeper into, well, what are some of the problems with this? But like, think about some of the curricula that like, say they integrate coding and art. Okay, well, they might make it so you can like draw something, and it kind of relates to geometry, maybe, depending on how you code it, but it's generally very limited in terms of the things you can create. And while a fun or neat experience, it just often pales in comparison to actually pulling out different tools that are designed for creating art, like pencil and paper, paintbrush and canvas, clay, glass, etc. So let's hone in on the music side of things. So the first subsection is on music functionality in Scratch 2.0. So they provide some pictures of the blocks, and they complement Scratch by saying you get immediate feedback on these blocks. When you click on a play note, you'll hear what that note is. When you click on a play sound, you'll hear what that sound is. It makes it very easy compared to some other languages where you might have to actually like write things out. And so in figure 2, they actually like show here's what it would look like in Scratch, and then the same thing in Max, which was previously called Max MSP, and then tone.js. And it just shows that it's significantly easier to have one block that you can click on to play a sound as opposed to having to like initialize and then sequence together a potential algorithm or whatever in order to actually hear the sound. They also say that there are 3 different types of audio playback. So there's MIDI pitched instruments, MIDI drums, and then audio files as sounds or loops. What they mention is that although there are 3 different types, they're inconsistent among the 3 different types. So for example, you can set tempo for the pitched instruments and the drums, but you can't set your tempo, which is the speed, for your audio files, which are the sound blocks, which are the play sound or play sound until done blocks, which by the way, play sound until done, as the authors note, is one of the most confusing things for some of the students that I previously worked with, because they often don't realize that it won't move on to the next block in your algorithm until that sound has completed, however short or long it is, and that the play sound block will basically play that block simultaneously with the next block in the algorithm. So it sometimes confuses kids. So if you're working on Scratch for the very first time with music, be prepared for that. I'd highly recommend thinking through some different questions that you might be able to ask them. And I've actually got multiple podcasts on questioning techniques if you want to check them out at jaredoleary.com. I'll link to them in the show notes. Now, the authors also mentioned that there's like a bit of a confusion around the pitched instruments and the drums in terms of how they work. Because for the play note, there's a parameter in there and you're able to change what note it is as well as the duration. So you might pick MIDI note 65. But for the drums, you're not picking the MIDI note, you're picking the instrument rather than a pitch. And then you also have the duration as a parameter. So the authors note that it's just confusing for kids because you're only able to have one instrument per sprite for the pitched instruments going on at the same time, unless you get a little cheeky with the timing through parallelism. But for percussion, you're able to have multiple instruments that you can play simultaneously. So that can be a little confusing for kids. But speaking of the parameters that I just mentioned in terms of like duration or like the parameter for the pitch, this can be a constraint for some kids in terms of like what timing is even possible with the numbers that you can put in there. And then how do the numbers shape how people use it? And so in the final paragraph on this particular subsection, they talk about how Scratch doesn't doesn't actually allow you to synthesize new sounds, like to be able to design or craft your own new sounds by changing the waveform and whatnot through ADSR, which is the attack, decay, sustain, release, which is a very fundamental thing to most digital audio workstations or DAWs, music programs, synthesizers, etc. So by not having this functionality, students are limited to basic MIDI instruments or recorded sounds. So that too can be a limiting factor when engaging with music in Scratch, which by the way, it also might be a good thing because then you're not overwhelming students with too many things. I'm going to argue with myself here. And the authors do that as well. Like they're very good at being able to say, hey, this is great, but also let's talk about this. Some things to work on. Speaking of things to work on, here's the next section. This one is on learning music coding music in Scratch. So they talk about how this is a bottom-up approach that is typically used from a constructionist standpoint, which some critics have argued creates a bit of a problem with control structures and how some kids will often use just a ton of small scripts that aren't necessarily serving as functions. So it kind of makes things incoherent, etc. But this approach of having to drag in a new block for each one of the pitches, instruments, durations, whatever, can make it so that you end up spending a lot of time just dragging out blocks and engaging in Scratch's version of syntax, cleanup and whatnot, rather than actually just like making music with code. Now, if you think back to the episode that I did that was talking about Sonic Pi, which uses the language Ruby, which is a very light language, like it's super fast. One of the reasons why that language was used is because it's so quick to type. You're not bogged down by the syntax. You're not having to drag and drop blocks. You're not having to type in semicolons. You're just able to quickly create music, which is important because that platform, generally speaking, is intended to be used live for creating live music. So with Scratch, on the other hand, it just might be a little difficult or cumbersome to create longer pieces of music. So for example, in figure 3, they show that Twinkle Twinkle Little Star requires a bunch of blocks kind of all sequenced together. And it's not very easy to understand what's going on just by looking at it, unless you like happen to be more fluent with music making or experienced. But one of the things that they kind of like offhandedly mention is that for moments like these where you have like this song that's just like absurdly long in terms of the algorithm, they would sometimes challenge kids or even adults to just think of how could you make this song with as little amount of code as possible, which I think is a really interesting challenge. Like John Stapleton has mentioned this before in conversations. You listen to the episodes with John. I'll link him in the podcast because John is awesome. But John Stapleton has like mentioned tiny code, which is like this really unique thing that I've seen on like Twitter or some other places where they will try and like create artwork or music or whatever, or even a game with like only a few lines of code, which is just really fascinating. If you're also like an efficiency nerd and code efficiency nerd like I am, I highly recommend checking out and diving deeper into that world. And I'll try and include some links in the show notes. Now, there's a really interesting discussion right after figure 3. This is on PDF page 8 for myself, that talks about how the typical approach that's used to create music in platforms like Scratch, or honestly even in some music classes, it focuses on very granular music concepts, often out of context. And it does not encourage or enable kids to apply their prior understandings or even experiment with new understandings in a meaningful way. And so they provide a really interesting example of a different type of curriculum that uses like chunks of melodies and allows students to focus more on like larger chunks rather than individual notes, to experiment with different phrases, tunes, etc. And then it's not until later that they actually then dive into the individual notes and pitches and being able to modify those. So a way that I can try and relate this to people who are not as versed in music making is think of it like you have an algorithm where it runs a sequence of distinct functions. Like you have a function that makes a robot do a flip, and then another function that makes a robot spin around in circles, and then another function that makes a robot, I don't know, shoot a basketball or something. The approach that is discussed here is being able to move those functions around into a different order and see what happens if I remove this one, or add in more of this other one, or change the sequence, etc. What could we make the robot do? Or in this case, what could we make for a new melody or song? And then it's not until later that they actually like double click on one of those functions and go, okay, that function for making the robot shoot a basketball, what if you wanted to change it so that it would shoot a long shot or a short shot or a very high or a low shot or a bounce shot, etc. So it doesn't start there. It starts first with the abstraction, shooting a ball, without being able to focus on the granularity, and then it dives into it later. This was a really interesting point, which is why I'm kind of sitting with it a little bit more. And it kind of reminds me of like the use, modify, create theory that I've talked about previously, where you kind of gradually work your way down toward the nitty gritty of creating. First, you start off with just playing with something, testing it out, figuring out what you can do in a platform or a game or whatever. Then you go and you start modifying, maybe changing some of the functions around, like I mentioned, maybe changing a parameter or two. Then after some comfort, then maybe you might create your own. So the same thing could be done with like integration. You could focus on the more abstract things to just immediately be able to create things that are satisfying rather than jumping into, okay, we're going to learn how to sequence together notes. Well, I mean, maybe that's interesting, maybe not. And to argue with myself from earlier, in Sonic Pi, you could synthesize sounds and like adjust all sorts of stuff, which was cool. But I didn't start kids there. I started with them just being able to sequence together or play in parallel different musical snippets or loops, or even some sequences of like MIDI notes and whatnot. Kind of like with Scratch, but with way more control over what you can do in them. Here's a really interesting paragraph. So this is the third paragraph right after figure 3. This is on PDF page 8. Quote, examined from a music technology angle, Freeman and Magerko classify educational music programming languages by the layer of musical interaction they afford and thus the form of musical thinking they prescribe. Sub-symbolic programming languages prioritize synthesis and control of time at an extremely low level. Symbolic languages offer editing at the individual note level, usually via MIDI. Hierarchical languages deal with musical form and allow loops or motives to be layered and remixed. The most powerful of the bunch are clearly sub-symbolic languages, offering near limitless flexibility and control for expert and professional coders. Yet, the manipulation of low-level processes requires patience, determination, and a lot of time and experience to build up the knowledge to implement in a practical setting. We have observed that novice Scratch users sometimes get hung up and frustrated after the first few short programs they write, lacking ever a moment of true self-expression and failing to develop the knowledge and motivation to progress further, end quote. And the next paragraph says, quote, hierarchical languages do not always support lower-level sound editing, meaning that advanced users will inevitably reach a ceiling on what they can express with the tool. EarSketch, for example, allows the programming of beats, but disallows modifying single pitches within a melody. However, this constraint is not necessarily a bad thing. Educational programming languages should not serve as the end-all, be-all, but rather as a meaningful stage in a learner's development, end quote. That's a great point. Like, I'm recording on a program called Ableton Live. It kind of looks like an Excel spreadsheet, depending on what mode you're in, or it looks more like a traditional DAW or DAW, where you can like record multiple tracks or MIDI tracks simultaneously. I love it. It's something that professional musicians, producers use, etc. And so when I get on a platform like GarageBand, which is like more entry level, I am just like, wait, I can't do this either. I just like feel so held back. But if I had never used a DAW before and was brand new to like music production and whatnot, I think I'd probably much rather prefer GarageBand, an entry level thing, rather than Ableton, which is professional level. So even though Scratch might not have like the best ways of integrating music, perhaps it's best for that experience level of the kids that you're working with. It depends on what their goals are and what their experiences and backgrounds are. Because again, everything in education is pretty gray. Some things are great for some things, and then they're terrible for other things or different contexts. And by the way, the creativity within constraints is like a whole thing. Actually, the people who were in my dissertation for the discussion forum that I looked at that had like 10,000 some odd members in it, one of the themes that was coming up was people talking about the reason why they engage with chiptunes, which is music made from like retro video game and like computer hardware. The reason why they liked it is because of the constraints. It was difficult to make. They were limited in what they could do with like number of oscillators or tracks or how fast or slow or their pitch range, etc. Or even like what kind of waveforms could we actually use? All that fun stuff. Some people really like those constraints. And then other people looked at it and went, nah, I liked the aesthetic of chiptunes, but I want to be able to add in a bunch of other stuff. And so there's a big old debate in the community. It's really interesting. Check it out in the dissertation. I'll link to it. I think it's in chapter 4 and 6 when I talk about it. But anyways, the next section on this paper is titled Inconsistent Timing in Scratch Music Playback. So honestly, I think this section probably makes more sense if you look at the different figures, because they basically talk about how if you want to have like a beat that has like a bass, a hi-hat, and like a snare all playing at the same time, and you want to loop it, it's very difficult to have all three of those line up consistently over an extended period of time. They slowly get out of sync. And so the authors talk about like different workarounds that people have tried, like different ways that you can do it. But the main point is that something as basic as having 3 parts playing at the same time is surprisingly difficult to pull off in Scratch 2.0. And by the way, if you hear a little pitter patter, it's my dog walking around in the background. He had contractors over all day, so I'm like recording later in the evening, and she wants to be with me. So I'm letting her. So if you hear a little pitter patter, that's Minnie. Say hi. All right, so in the next section, it talks about some potential ideas for new ways that Scratch 3.0 might be able to fix some of these constraints. But Scratch 3.0 is already out, and the authors also mention that Scratch X, which is like their experimental side of Scratch, kind of shows some really cool things that actually haven't come out yet that I'm aware of in the main version of Scratch. But I'll include a little link to Scratch X if you haven't done that before. There's some really cool stuff you can do in that you can't actually do in normal Scratch. Like one of them was to be able to time your blocks to music in a Spotify song, which is really cool. All right, but at the end of these like unpacking scholarship episodes, I usually like to share some lingering questions and thoughts. I've already kind of like shared some of my thoughts throughout this, but the main point of this is I wanted to kind of share or problematize the idea of in what ways might CS integration constrain engagement with one or more disciplines? So this particular paper is saying it's constraining music making, but I would argue if you had a general music lesson that used computational thinking, that would constrain your engagement with computer science. So it goes both ways, but obviously that depends on how you implement it. Just a very general, quick example that I can think of. Far too often when we look at like a Venn diagram of where one discipline or domain might be able to overlap with the other, we focus on the connection points at the cost of focusing on everything outside of those connection points on the Venn diagram. So yeah, you can talk about how to sequence notes together to create a melody if you do music and computer science, but depending on the platform, you might not be able to even discuss what timbre is and how to change it or shape it if the platform doesn't allow for that. But going back to what I mentioned earlier, constraints aren't always a bad thing. I also think it's important to consider when is that okay and when is that problematic? There's no one size fits all answer to that. So it's really kind of up to you and the kids you're working with in whatever context you're in. But I enjoyed this paper. I think it was really cool to think through and problematize some of the constraints or limitations of a platform that I very much so enjoy. As you can hear in the podcast that I've linked in the show notes, like especially the one with Mitch Resnick, we talk about Scratch a good amount. But I just want to say I appreciate you listening. And again, if you're interested, this paper is available for free. I include a link to it in the show notes. So check it out at jaredoleary.com. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Stay tuned for another episode next week. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.